Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Three Seasons podcast, where we talk about the three seasons of your wealth accumulation, protection, and succession. Today, we have a very special guest on. We have Ngaio Davis of Koru Cremation, and they do something really special. And we've kind of been talking behind the scenes for a little while, and I wanted to have her on because the end of life planning is a huge part of our total life planning. Ngaio, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Tyson. And I appreciate that you've asked me to come on. It's not every day that people outside of the death care industry approach death care providers and say, "Hey, do you want to come on and onto my show that's often about financial planning stuff and talk?" So super appreciate that. And just so those of your listeners who are watching will be able to make sense of my name, the easy way to pronounce it is Ngaio. Um, and
I'm
and I
sorry.
own, no, don't worry about it. It's a name that trips up so many people. It's not common to Canada. It's a Maori name from New Zealand, and that's half my heritage. My father's Maori, my mom is Canadian, and the name of my business, Koru, Cremation Burial Ceremony. Koru is also a Maori word, and the easy way to pronounce Koru is Koru. And I chose that name for the business, particularly. Actually, I didn't start out with that name. I started with classic cremation and funeral services. And as I got into doing what I was doing within about a year and a half, I realized that what my intentions were not even being reflected in the name that I'd chosen for the company. So I changed to Koru, and Koru is a word that encompasses um, just that life and death cycle, that life is this kind of unending motion, and that death is a part of that. The symbol that is often used to depict the word koru is the unfurling of a fern. So it's a
Okay.
it's a really important and valuable and well-known word within the Maori community and within New Zealand. And I felt like it just was the name that was going to fit to do the work that I do. So thank you.
Well, that's great. I thank you for sharing the story behind it. That often it gives more meaning to the name of the business
Yeah.
and the journey and everything. That's wonderful. Nayo, how did you get into this industry to begin with?
Yeah, kind of a really, I would say, different loop around from a lot of people who I've talked to who became funeral directors and got into funeral service. I'm a Red Seal journeywoman carpenter, and I worked for many years in construction, doing residential construction for the most part, on Vancouver Island, building homes. And it's hard work. If anybody's ever been, involved in the trades, it's hard on your body. And after probably about a dozen or so years of doing it, and this time of year was terrible when it's it's cold and it's raining, and hot summers were no fun either because no matter what the weather is, you're out in it. And I just realized that my body was not going to be able to support me the longer I kept up doing that work. So it was just this realization that if I want to be able to have the kind of life that I want to have, I need to make some changes. I did never, not ever once did I think funeral service is what I would get into. So it just kind of bumped into me is how I described it. And that bumping into me caused me to really want to learn more about what actually happened in funeral service. What did a funeral director do? And the more I learned about it, the more I bugged people I actually knew who were in funeral service, the more I realized that this was a fit. The work that was required of the people who do it would fit me, and I really felt like I could fit the work. So it really was more of a calling that kind of came to me when I didn't know that this is what I needed. I just knew I needed a change. And so that's how I got into it. And I've been doing it now for, man, I guess I'm probably getting close to 25 years. So it
Wow.
was the right move.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's funny because on the financial industry side, a lot of people, when you interview them 20 and 30 years down the road, you ask them how they got started. They also like it was by accident. They
Oh,
knew
no.
somebody at the bank or somebody was hiring and they were fresh out of college and they sort of fell into it. And that's funny that you have the same story that it just sort of showed up for you and it
Yeah.
worked.
Yeah, it worked. Thank goodness. It just goes to show you when you just kind of put yourself out there and say, okay, change needs to happen. Keep your mind open.
Yeah, right.
The right thing comes along. Yeah.
Fantastic. W with you've been in the industry long enough now to see um different demographics, different age groups kind of go through the processes that you encounter when you do end of life planning. What are some of the challenges that you've seen along the years that have always stayed the same, or maybe that
Mm.
are kind of new and developing?
Yeah. I think sadly there's more challenges that have just stayed the same.
Okay.
And Tyson, probably the biggest one that I see regularly is that people just avoid planning, period. So they avoid conversations about end of life, about our own mortalities, whether it's about themselves or someone close to them, an elderly parent, for instance. And that avoidance leads to nothing getting done. We all end up dying, and that's just what happens. And somebody needs to be able to then manage what happens, manage the after death care that needs to be provided. And usually it falls on family members. If there's a will and the executor named in the will is not a family member, then obviously it would be that person. But usually it's the family members who do it. And so, you just imagine if you've never had to deal with anything to do with death and dying. You do not know what the options are. Maybe the most information you have has come from TV or a neighbor or something you might have heard from somebody years ago. It's really overwhelming. And then on top of that, you're just feeling sad. It's really difficult for many people. And I acknowledge that not all deaths are devastating for people, but it's always a complete world changer, I would say,
Yeah.
and game changer. So, regardless of your emotional um, ability to handle it or your emotional connection to the person who's died, it is still a huge game changer. So, there's a lot that has to be attended to. And, I don't actually know what the stats are, but it's definitely, a very small percentage of people who actually are taking those brave steps to get into conversation and start asking questions and start learning what do I actually have to know? What will actually happen when I die or my mom dies or whoever it is?
Yeah. That,
Yeah.
that's a lot. But that is maybe a really good segue is on a very kind of simplified level, what does happen? So we've
Yeah.
lost a family member. We know that within a week or two, we need to make some decisions here, and we need to um, do some. If there was an end of life planning, we need to take some action as the surviving family members. What does that kind of look like for the average family or the person put in
Yeah,
charge?
yeah, exactly. What does it look like? So the first thing they have to do is probably choose a funeral home or a death care provider. You're not required by law in BC to have to hire a funeral home or a death care provider, and I use those two words interchangeably. It's the same thing. Most people are familiar with the term funeral home. I use death care provider because it just feels more encompassing for the work that we do. But you have to choose a death care provider unless you want to do it yourself. And that's a whole other topic. I'm happy to talk about families doing it themselves. Overwhelmingly, most people will choose to hire professionals to do that. So, who do you hire? On what basis do you hire them? Is it because they're just down the road? Is it because your nana's uncle's brother used them? Is it because of budget? Is it because of maybe that they have cemetery property and you want to use their cemetery? Like what are all the factors that go into actually choosing a funeral home? And sometimes people are calling around and they're shopping
Yeah.
And somebody's died and now they're just scrambling to try and ask questions. So finding a funeral provider, trying to ask questions that hopefully make sense to you as to why you're asking them. So it would be important probably to ask about price. It would be important to ask about like what are your practices? How do you help us? What do we need to know? Um, kind of get a sense of how transparent and willing the funeral provider is to just share information freely and openly on that first phone call. And perhaps, they can offer to send email information as well. Have a look at websites. Many websites will not have specific information about pricing, but they will have information about who they are, if they own multiple funeral homes, or are they a one of, are they local, are they, part of a giant corporation? Some funeral homes will have pricing on there. So that's part of the first steps. And then when you call them and you've made your decision, it could be that one of the first interactions you need to have with them is to decide on the transportation and moving the person who's died from where they've died away from that place. And
Yeah.
usually, when they're moved away, they're moved to the funeral home who they've chosen to look after them. It doesn't always have to be that way, but that's a norm. And then you need to have a meeting, and you need to be able to sit down with a licensed funeral director, and that funeral director is going to find out who is the legal decision maker. So that'll be based on whether the deceased had a will or did not have a will. And then they're going to try and understand, were there any discussions had before the person died? And if so, what was expressed? And if there weren't, that decision maker needs to be able to make all the decisions based on whatever they feel is right and what information they may have. So they'll be asked to decide on cremation or burial. They'll be asked to decide on how the deceased is going to be physically cared for. Do you want any physical care provided to the deceased? And who is going to do that? Do you want to participate in that, or is the funeral home going to look after that entirely on your behalf? And there's different levels of physical care that can be provided to the deceased. So they'll be talking about that. And then within that, there's all kinds of other little questions that will come up, like, would you want a cutting of your person's hair who died? Would you want fingerprint scans taken so that it could be, maybe that print could be engraved onto jewelry? So there's lots and lots of little things that will be talked about just in that realm. Vital statistics information needs to be collected so that the death can be registered. And so we ask questions that some people just are really floored that we're even asking them. Like, who is the deceased parents? And where were they born? And what was their mom's maiden name? And sometimes those people lived and like 100 years ago, if the
Right.
person who died now is 95, their parents are clearly not alive. And people are usually quite stunned and thinking, why am I even being asked this? So we need to gather that information so we can register the death. We need to coordinate with the crematorium or the cemetery. We need to understand what kinds of ceremonies and rituals are important, and for who will those ceremonies and rituals be? Is it going to be just your family unit? So it might be quite a small group. Will it be for a bigger group? Do we need to have multiple different things going on? Perhaps there's a private viewing or visitation for the family with their person who has died. And then maybe they're going to the crematorium and bearing witness to the cremation starting. And then maybe after all of that, there's a memorial service or celebration of life. So all of these conversations happen within, a few days, usually, of having the person having died and the family reaching out to the funeral home. So I just rambled on for however many minutes. And can you imagine like that in conversation, and it's going back and forth and you're like, holy, I didn't even know I had to think about these things.
That's right. Yeah, that's a long checklist of like,
Yeah.
which one did we miss? And
Yeah.
so when families come in and they see you, Um, how do you normally start the process? Do you give like, these are like our three most common packages or bundle everything, or is everything a la carte where here's your 50 optionalities and let's go through and explain each of them?
Yeah.
What do you find is the best way for people who are sort of in their, you know, stress red line zone? How do you walk them through a decision making tree and help them, make a good decision?
Yeah, good question. And it really comes down to a lot of experience on our part, knowing what questions to ask, and then careful listening. So the way that we operate with Koru, so Rebecca, who's my licensed funeral director, myself, also a licensed funeral director, we don't just start off saying, here are your options, here's the menu, choose something. We just start by having conversations. Tell us about your person who has died. Did you ever have an opportunity to have discussion? Oh, you did. It wasn't very long. Did they say cremation or burial? And we can start to get a picture as we ask more questions. And as we gather that information through the questions we ask, then we will get to a point where we can say, it looks like, from what you're saying, probably this kind of bank of services will be what will help you the most. So maybe what you really need from us is just to help you look after all the essentials so that the cremation can happen and be able to provide you with what you need for death certificates, estate planning resources, return ashes to you. And then we're going to follow up with you in a couple of weeks because you mentioned you want to be able to organize a service, but it's just not something you can manage thinking about right now. So, that might be how the conversation goes, and it can go any number of ways. So I know with other funeral homes I worked at, they might have a different approach. But I found through the years that I've been doing it, it's best just to have conversations and not try and force people into decisions where they don't even have the information to begin with and they don't know why they're being asked to make these decisions.
Right. That's that's very refreshing to hear. As we talked before offline, is there's another side to the
Yeah.
industry that
Yeah.
is sales driven, and it gets quite competitive, much like my industry, where people don't look at client care. They mostly look at how much business can we accumulate and what can we get done. And, sometimes there's sales quotas and other things. So for the rest of the industry, um, what do you think are some of the takeaways or like the feelings that are given to
Mm.
people who've gone through this process versus somebody who's like yourself, who's more of like a planner, and discussing versus like the salesperson? What do you think the average takeaway is for clients that can maybe have a bit of both
Yeah.
feelings, right? A foot in each plot.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting question. And I'll just kind of preface it by saying when I worked for one of the large corporations that have many, many different funeral homes and crematoriums and cemeteries around BC, um, I would often have good relations, but there always was a bit of a separation, shall we say. We never got super, super close. There was a cemetery just down the road from us that was a municipal cemetery, community cemetery. And I had a pretty good relationship at the time with one of the women who worked there. And she said to me, people come in here after they've been to the funeral home you work in, and we are like the confessional booth, and they'll just open up and they'll say, oh my goodness, you wouldn't believe what we just were asked and the things that we went through. And everything was fine. That was often it. But I didn't leave feeling like really, really satisfied with how I got looked after. So now fast forward to me having my own business, locally owned. I do this because I really believe um, in the change that we can make and the help that we can give to people. And now we have become the confessional. People come to us.
Mm,
They don't see us as like regular funeral homes. They'll often say that. And in the early days of me having started this business, I would get a little annoyed and almost insulted. I'd be like, what do you mean? We're
Yeah.
not like a regular funeral business because do you know how hard it was for me to get started and get my license from the government? And then I quickly realized that this is one of the greatest compliments I could ever ask for because this really was what I was wanting to do was just say, hey, there is a different way to practice this. And so the confessionals that now we get are very similar to what I was hearing from that cemetery and all those years ago. And it's so it's always the same. It's always I felt pressured to have to spend more on things, usually like caskets and urns. I couldn't believe how much they were charging me, and I really didn't understand what I was getting for that. Um, and just feeling like they were just another cog in the machine that made that whole thing move forward, and feeling like they weren't really included in what was going on. So even though it was, say their husband who had died and they'd been married for 50 years, they just had these feelings of now the funeral home is taking over. So that's a really kind of I find it troubling that that's still a common uh, just feeling of uneasiness that people get
Yeah.
because there are so many good people who work in this industry, and the ones working even under the big corporates who are focused on bottom line and sales, it's not, they're just obeying what they need, what they're being told they have to do.
That's
And
right.
it's more that overarching structure that to me has faults in it. When we do human people work, we need to be able to just be with people in a human way. And it can't be about bottom lines and we got to meet that quota. So yeah, I know that there's a shift, there is a change within the industry itself, which is fantastic. I'm anxious for it to happen quicker. And I get really envious of what's going on in the States because there's so much more willingness to change, but it is starting to happen here. And I'm really, really glad to be a part of that change and just glad to know for people in general that there are differences that are happening. There are different ways to look at death care and how it's offered.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, on our side of the industry, whatever happens in the States usually happens, 3 to 5 years later. Like regulation and everything, it takes time to trickle through, and we
Yeah,
have our way of doing things, and so that's interesting to hear. It happens in other industries too, and
yeah.
it's not just us. When when I look at your website and some of the emails and stuff that we've had back and forth, your emails talk about some of the optionalities they have for the
Mm,
cremation services, and there's some environmental friendly ones, and what you do is. So I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about some of the options and some of the choices that people have that I thought they were cool, and I kind of think this is maybe the way that more should go.
mm.
But I'd love for you to talk about, some of those little bits and pieces and what makes them special with you guys.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, one of our premises, not only that we're locally owned, we're women led, and that really perks people up. And we're very eco focused. So, eco in terms of wanting to be able to do as much as we can to reduce our environmental impact through the industry that we work within. And so, what I mean by that is there are our conventional practices were never about how do we protect the environment. There was before big industry got involved in things when it was community looking after their dead. Most people were buried because that was the only option. Here in Canada, there weren't
Hmm.
crematoriums all over the place. And those burials were pretty eco-friendly because there would be a homemade casket usually. It would have been community who was preparing the deceased and looking after the deceased, so there weren't chemicals used in the caring and physical care being provided to that deceased person. And then probably the grave was hand dug. There wouldn't have been any other liners, they call them, or vaults that go into the grave when it's dug before the casket goes in. So the casket would have had that direct contact with the earth. And because the deceased wasn't embalmed, over time, there would have been just natural biodegradation happening. And
Hmm.
that now we call that a green burial. And now, it can be a bit of a buzzword, and it's a great buzzword to have. But fast forward to what we have going on now, and death industry has been industrialized. There are very few communities that do everything themselves. And what we have to offer in BC is burial and cremation. With burial, we do have green burial options. They're not a ton of them, but they are there. So the green burial options are like what I described for those old-timey community burials. And a conventional burial, um, the deceased is embalmed, so there's chemicals that are put into the deceased body. That doesn't necessarily pose a big impact on the environment once the person is buried, but it poses a big impact on just somebody's making those chemicals. Somebody is using those chemicals to put them into the deceased, and there's always waste of those chemicals that goes into our city wastewater systems. So there's that kind of environmental impact with the chemicals. And then conventional cemeteries will often have all kinds of additional things that have to also go into the ground and on top of the ground. And there's an impact on making those things as well as putting them in place. With cremation, our option with cremation is flame cremation, which means we use natural gas so that we can produce high heats to be able to cremate the deceased person within several hours. And the amount of natural gas, I don't have the specific numbers, but people from those who have done, some of the science behind it, will claim that the amount of natural gas used is enough to be able to drive, definitely throughout BC kind of thing and
Yeah.
back. And then there's emissions that are being emitted into the air, and the emissions are going to contain not only the I guess some of the remnants that might be with the deceased. People will talk about mercury in their teeth, but it will also contain anything that was mixed in with the casket, for instance. If the cremation casket was made of perhaps plywood, or at least had a plywood base. We know with plywood, it's made with laminating different layers of wood together, and you're using usually not real environmentally friendly glues for that. So that becomes part of the emissions. So the impact with flame cremation is pretty big. You have a carbon dioxide, uh, I guess, that ends up in the environment as well. And all of this is just what we have. So what we do with Koru, uh, most people are choosing cremation in the Lower Mainland and in BC. So our cremation rate is probably in and around the 85 to 90% with the clients that we look after. And we want to be able to support their choices. And so we do what we can to green up cremation on our end so that our clients don't have to feel bad about choosing flame cremation if being environmentally conscious is an important value for them. So we
Okay.
do things like purchase cremation caskets that are locally made, and they're just made of natural pine wood. They have a pine wood base, and then they have a cardboard top. So they're not being trucked in from the US. They're not being freighted in by train from another part of Canada. It comes from Abbotsford to here. There are other choices for people, for sure. And with all of our cremation and burial caskets and shrouds, we set a standard that they either have to be made in Canada, so that we're trying to do our best to reduce all of the transportation that becomes involved, or they have to be made of environmentally sustainable products. So if they have come in from elsewhere, what are they made of? And is that at least going to have a positive environmental effect? So we've made those kinds of determinations for our clients that they don't even necessarily know about. That's just what we do. We support Bullfrog Power, which is a Canadian organization that works to put clean energy across Canada onto the grid, so average users can be able to use it. And
Okay.
it's like a third party utility. So corporations, businesses, individuals can decide to purchase and contribute monthly, like a utility bill, to Bullfrog Power, and you know that your contributions are helping to put that clean energy on. So for us, it's a form of an offset. We've worked hard to build relationships with crematoriums that we know do their best to maintain their crematoriums. Our preferred one is one of the newest crematoriums in BC. So that means that their cremation time is lower. They don't have to cremate as long because their machines are more efficient. It also means that they don't have to use as much natural gas just to get their machines up to temperature.
Yeah.
Some of the crematoriums who've been around for a while and haven't been able to replace their equipment, it can take hours for their cremation chamber just to get up to the temperature to be able to start cremating somebody. So in all that time, you're just burning gas, burning gas. So we think about those things as well. We have an electric car to be able to do a lot of our errands and deliveries and meetings with people. And it's amazing. I get a report every month on how much CO2 we've managed to avoid just by using an electric car. And then, we just really try and think deeply and hard about our everyday office workings and everything we do. Uh, we have quite a variety of biodegradable urns, for instance, that we'll offer to people rather than, there are other urns for sure that are available, but we like to have a large selection so that people can feel like if the environment is important and they chose cremation, they can also choose an urn for their person's ashes that perhaps wasn't made in India or China or somewhere else. So
Yeah.
that's part of what we do. And the one last thing I'll say is we've also deliberately chosen to only offer natural physical death care to our clients on site. And so I can say I'm a licensed embalmer. I used to be quite a part of the embalming teaching scene in BC. I really loved embalming, and it's really harmful to the people who do it. And since opening up my own business and choosing not to offer embalming in-house, I cannot believe how great it is to be in an environment like in a bathing room with a decedent and not have all those chemicals in the air. The whole smell of the room is like no other prep room that I've ever been in. So we're not putting those kinds of harmful chemicals on the deceased. We're not being exposed to them, and they're not going into, as waste down into the drain either.
Yeah.
So, we're really trying to uh, do as much as we can. We know that we don't always get it right. Trying to be like a B Corp or get all those certifications, it takes a lot. It's something that I am hoping that, we can achieve one day. And I just feel like as long as we are genuine in our belief of saying eco-conscious and eco-friendly is an important value to us, we're not just greenwashing you because we want to be able to
Yeah.
jump into the green burial movement. This is truly a part of what we believe in. Then I think that offers a lot, even though we don't get it right all the time.
Yeah. No, I think that's really fair. We see that on the investment side too, where there was a big trend to they want environmental, they want social responsible investing, and
Yeah.
companies would do what we called greenwashing. And they would say that they're doing things or rearrange some of the titles or board members or whatever to fit a metric to say that they're
Right.
socially responsible, but it's really business as usual. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, that's interesting. But that is fascinating about all of the different things that you can do and the attention to detail and details that most people would never think about.
Yeah.
That is really it's really nice that you guys take the time to go through that and have built the your system in your processes to incorporate all of that. In the fall of last year, I guess early fall, is you guys held education seminars for people that can come out and learn about this before their event. Because
Mm,
pre-planning is so much better than reactive planning after the fact.
yeah.
What are one or two things that you guys cover in your pre-planning seminars to educate the community and educate families about what to expect?
Yeah. Well, there's so much to talk about, so it sometimes can be hard to just say one or two things. But so I came up with kind of like 6 steps that I think are pretty clear for people to understand. I won't necessarily go through all 6, but the first one that really helps people get going is just taking time to think about yourself. What do you value? What is it that has really guided you through your life? And then how do you see that being able to fit in with your after death plans? So, like the environment. Um, I have a friend, we've been friends since high school, and she has been always ahead of the curve when it's come to the environment. She's been that person all her life. And I think of her and I think like how she would so want her death to also reflect that. There's no way that she would just then all of a sudden um, be looked after by a funeral business that is not deeply also concerned about that and just going through the motions. She would want that to be reflected. So just, what do you value? What's important to you? So start with that and write things out, have conversations, do some research. And just part of that research is talking to people or going on the big bad world of the internet and Google searches, but you will through your searches you'll start to find things, and particularly if you're really earnest about what it is that you're looking for, and hopefully don't just go down the rabbit holes of some of the trendy things. But when I talked earlier about there being a change that's happening, one of the changes are that there are now death care educators who just dedicate their time to helping people understand how they can get started, what their options are, and just guiding them down that path. So if you do those 2 things, just think about what's important to you, and then be brave and start to do some research. And know that it's a process. None of this will probably be something that you can just whip up in a week and say, okay, I did
That's
that.
right. That's right.
It's going to take some time. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that is very, very true. Um, and yeah, the planning thing, I think it's not something that you want to do in 15 minutes. I think it's something that should
Yeah.
be talked about because it's going to be you're a long-term resident once you're there, whatever decision that you make, right?
So
And
true. And it's so intertwined with so many different things, like financial planning, like that ends up being a part of this because you have to have a budget. How much are you going to spend on all this? People can think about all their perfect scenarios and then they realize, I don't have enough money to pay for that. So how am I going to figure that out?
that's a
Wills
great,
and estates, like
yeah,
all of that becomes part of this end of life planning.
yeah. Actually, that's a really good point. So you raised a couple, but on the wills and estate part, so if somebody doesn't have a will, the estate has to go through probate, and need to get a whole bunch of authorizations in order to become the trustee for the estate to enact
Yeah.
all of the things. What happens with the death care when there's no will? We don't have 6 months to go through probate and
Yeah.
to go to court. Like, what are the steps for somebody who doesn't have a will and we need to take care of this? Um,
Yeah.
what do we do?
Well, fortunately, the BC government has laid out an order of priority of relatives if the person who died without a will. So it starts with a spouse and it goes to an adult child after that, and it goes down this list. So if there is no spouse, then it goes to the next one, and so on. And so then that person becomes the legal decision maker for the death care stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're also going to be the one who's going to get that letter of administration, likely they will be, but that ends up being its own process. But, the government realizes that we do have to take care of the dead. We can't just wait for the courts and do things and 6 months later make a decision. That's just
Hmm.
not going to cut it. So fortunately, there's that. And most, I don't know about most, but I will say that we have many, many people who do not have wills. One of the things that can really trip people up, though, is they don't have a will. Um, Perhaps they thought of themselves as having a modest financial position in life, so they
Yes,
didn't see the necessity for a will because in their mind, a will is just for I've got some grand estate and lots of, gifts and things to bequeath, and I don't have that. They may not have any family members that living family members period, or living family members that they're close to. They might be estranged from them. And their people who are sort of like their chosen family might be friends or neighbors and people who have become so important and dear and trusted to them.
that's right.
But if they didn't write a will and they didn't appoint that important, trusted non-family member as executor, that person has zero input into what's going to happen with the care of their body. And they may know everything. They may have been the one who knew that that person wanted to be buried and not cremated. They may have all that information, but they don't get to be a part of it. So,
Yeah,
super important, even if you don't have a ton of money, write a will, appoint an executor. If you have strong feelings about how you want to be looked after, and you know that person who will have that information is not part of your family line.
yeah. That that's awesome. Thank you for saying that because we say that too. You got to have a
Yeah,
will.
sure.
You got to have a will. And they say, "Oh, the only thing I have is credit card debt." And it's
Yeah.
like, no, no, you still need somebody's got to be able to take care of
Yes.
all of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Fantastic. And then you did mention budget. So if somebody comes
Yeah.
into the end of life planning and we have clients that really have a tight budget and we have clients that really like money's not a thing when it's going to come to this type of process.
Right.
What's sort of the spectrum that people can look at? And then maybe what do you see as like the average family? What kind of price ranges are we kind of looking at?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So I'm going to talk about cremation because it's probably the easiest because most people choose cremation, and that's what most people are kind of looking at for budgets. So the range of pricing, and this is for what we would call like a direct cremation or essential cremation, which in funeralese means that for the funeral home or the funeral provider, we're just looking after all of the essentials so that cremation is done. We're not also part of ceremonies and services and things like that. So it's just
Okay.
basic stuff. So that price range can be anywhere from about $1,000 all the way up to probably about $6,000
Okay.
for more or less. We're doing the same thing. There'll be differences, of course, within that, but that's the range. And so, obviously middle of the road is right in around the $3,500, $4,000 kind of mark. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if somebody had
And
a
it,
budget
yeah.
of like 15 or $20,000 for end of life care, including services and an event or something like that. I mean, like that's a not a huge budget, but that's a reasonable expectation, a reasonable budget.
If they're looking at cremation, then yes, it is.
Okay.
And part of my caveat to that would be if if the cremated remains, the ashes, are going to go to a cemetery and be interred in a cemetery afterwards, then you may have to be a little more circumspect about your budget because you also have that cost at the cemetery to purchase the cemetery plot. If that's not part of what's going to happen after the cremation, and you want to just be able to do what you want with services, then that's a very healthy budget. Yeah, for sure. And not to say that you couldn't also include a cemetery budget in that for interment of the cremated remains, but just to say that you need to be aware that there will be other costs from the cemetery. Yeah. And if that's for a burial, probably not.
Okay.
So if you've already purchased your cemetery plot and you've got that 15 to 20,000 just for the services, and you're not having to also purchase the plot at the cemetery, then I would say yes, that's still a really healthy budget for a burial. But if the request is burial and you haven't purchased the cemetery plot, then likely that's not going to be enough. Some of the cemetery plots in the Lower Mainland are starting close to the $30,000 mark.
Okay.
And that's not all of them. You can certainly find cemetery plots in the Lower Mainland for much less than that. But you just need to really be aware that if your budget needs to include the purchase of the cemetery plot and you have a pretty like good cap on what that budget is, you may be needing to look at cemetery plots much further away from Vancouver or Burnaby to be able to
Gotcha.
get a more affordable plot. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. Can we switch gears a minute just for the last couple minutes here?
Yeah.
You've been in business for yourself for a while. What's probably the most important business lesson that you've learned putting the things together and coming from being under a corporation to being business for yourself? What have you found to be like the most powerful lesson that you've learned that you can maybe share with people?
Well, that's a good question. And probably after this podcast, I'll be like, oh, why didn't I say something
That's
else?
right. That's right.
Yeah. But so you know how we always as business owners, there's that thing like the customer is always right, and you have to do everything because the customer is right. What I believe that to mean for me is that when you listen to your customer and not just, an individual, but, everybody who's making up your customer base and those who you want to make up to your customer base, you
Hmm.
really listen, you really hear what it is that they are saying, and you can read in between the lines of that. Then that's when the decisions that you make for your business become something that are fruitful for everybody, not just for the business owner, but then for the people, the clientele who get to receive the services from you.
Right.
And it's I can be a bit of a hothead, so it's good for me to have lessons in humility like that, that I need to listen. I need to always. There's never a point where I get to just say, oh yeah, I know how to do this. I got this. I'm there. I'm never there. There's always a new lesson for me to learn from my clients. And just keeping that in mind and letting that guide me has been very valuable.
Very cool. Very cool. I always love that when I talk to different business owners because everybody's got a different paradigm. We've all gone through the ringer,
Ah,
but we get a different experience going through it, and everyone gets a different lesson. So I love asking that. Couple of questions that I ask as exit questions when I talk to people is, what book have you read that's been really impactful to you in your life or in your business?
hmm. Well, I will say that because of the work that I do, which is pretty deep work, my reading often tends to be something for me that's just not about making change in the world. And so my favorite book of all times has got to be The Hobbit and then
Okay,
The Lord of the Rings. I have read that whole series so many times, watched the movies, criticized the movies, go back and read the books. And one of my favorite sayings from that comes from Bilbo Baggins, and he says, "Shortcuts make for long delays." And I think for business owners, that is really a really good message to,
that
to
is.
keep in mind. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I love that.
Yeah.
And then the last question that I always ask, because of the day and age that we're in, is
Yeah.
are you listening to any podcasts? And which ones do you love?
Yeah, I love listening to political podcasts.
Okay.
That's my kind of like moment when I'm driving to yell and scream and shake my fist, and nobody around me gets to know what it's about. So I listen to Honestly with Barry Weiss.
Okay.
I'll listen to Mike Smith, his podcasts, which are just excerpts from his radio show. I listen to Fareed Zakaria and Bill Maher. So, and then I'll fit in some other more right-wing ones as well because I want to be able to have a spectrum. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. That's cool. All right.
yeah,
Um,
no death care stuff in there at all.
that's right. That's right. Sometimes you
Yeah,
gotta like unwind and like get broaden your like paradigm of viewing things, right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Um, where can people find you when if they have questions, if they want to reach out? How do people, read about you and get in touch with you?
Oh, yeah. So our website, which is just a shortened version of our name, korucremation.com. We have a newsletter. So I think when you go on the website, you can subscribe to the newsletter. Up until this year, the newsletter was coming out monthly, and now it'll come out every 2 months.
Okay.
And there'll also be, when you're on the newsletter, then you'll get updates about death cafes that I host. We do other just conversations, deep conversations on death and dying called Out in the Open. So we'll do those throughout 2025. And then starting this month, at the end of the month, I have an end of life pre-planning series that will go on for the next 5 months. And it'll be a webinar, so online, open to anybody, free, open to anybody who wants to come. And it's going to be on planning stuff. So how to get you started and then just getting into the details of it all. So
That's
yeah,
fantastic.
the newsletter is probably the best way to stay in touch. So thank you. Thanks for asking, Tyson.
No worries. Niall, thank you so much for coming
Yeah.
on. I really, really appreciate it. And as soon as we get off, I know I'm going to have questions that I forgot to ask that my clients have brought up. And so we'll probably have you back on again in 6 months or 9 months. And I know I'm going to have something else to ask you.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. It's been really
All right.
fun.
Thank
Yeah.
you.